Dust Valley was a town built on forgetting. It forgot the laws of the East, forgot the niceties of polite company, and most of all, it forgot to be kind. In the New Mexico Territory of 1883, the wind was the only constant companion, and it spoke in a language of grit that scoured paint from wood and hope from hearts. Dust was the first and last word in any conversation, coating the back of your throat, settling in the lines of your face, a fine red powder that turned the midday sun into a hazy, indifferent god. Here, a man's worth was measured by the speed of his hand and the weight of his purse, and a woman's worth was measured by the man who claimed her. Abigail Hensley had no man and no purse. At 24, she was a fixture of the town's pity and its scorn. An unmarried woman in a place where women were married off as soon as they were old enough to promise to obey. Her father, a blacksmith with hands like worn leather and a soul defeated by debt, had lost his forge a year prior, leaving them with nothing but a name and the charity of neighbors, a charity that tasted more like judgment every day. Abigail worked at the Blue Cactus, the only establishment in Dust Valley that could be called a diner. She served watery coffee and tough beef to cowhands and prospectors, her face set in a look of determined neutrality that the town mistook for prideful bitterness. They called her the Spinster, a name whispered behind cupped hands when she walked by, her spine straight as a gun barrel. Abigail heard the whispers. She simply chose not to bend to them. She believed in truth, hard work, and the fact that she was no man's property. This was a dangerous set of beliefs in Dust Valley. Cole Maddox was a man who believed in horses and silence. At 32, he ran a ranch on the outskirts of town, a sprawling piece of land where the wild mustangs he caught learned to accept a saddle. He'd come to the valley 3 years ago, a man with a past that clung to him like the dust itself. Whispers followed him, too, but they were of a different sort. They spoke of a time when the colt on his hip was not just for show, of a lightning-fast draw and eyes that missed nothing. They said he had been a gunslinger, a man who had earned his quiet life through violence. They also whispered of a woman, a fiancée lost years ago when a train was held up, a ghost that was said to walk the halls of his empty ranch house. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he moved with a stillness that was more intimidating than any swagger. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, seeing him as a coiled rattlesnake, best left undisturbed. He was a dangerous man, they agreed, 1 part ghost and 2 parts gunpowder. The social fabric of Dust Valley was woven with these simple, brutal threads. Men provided, and women were provided for. To step outside this order was to invite ruin. Abigail, with her sharp mind and sharper tongue, defied it daily. Cole, with his solitary life and unspoken history, lived entirely beyond its borders. They were 2 outcasts, orbiting the same miserable star, who had never so much as shared a nod of greeting. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat was a physical weight, and the air in the Gilded Cage saloon was thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. A group of men, led by Earl Drayton, a rancher whose wealth had made him arrogant and loud, were gathered around a table, their laughter a harsh, braying sound. Abigail was there, having brought a tray of stew over from the Blue Cactus, a common task when the saloon's kitchen was overwhelmed. She was clearing plates from a nearby table, her movements efficient and quiet, trying to be invisible. $100 says he cannot break that new stallion of his before the first snow, one man slurred, gesturing with his beer mug. Drayton laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. I will take that action. $100 is nothing. I would wager $500 on a matter of true impossibility. He paused, his eyes scanning the room and landing, with cruel precision, on Abigail. A smirk spread across his face. $500 says no man in this territory has the stomach to marry the Hensley girl. A wild mare is easier to tame. The table erupted in mean-spirited laughter. Other patrons turned, their faces alight with the cheap thrill of someone else's humiliation. Abigail froze, a stack of dirty plates heavy in her hands, The blood drained from her face, then rushed back in a hot, painful wave. Her world narrowed to the circle of leering faces, the smoke-filled air, the feeling of 100 eyes branding her with their contempt. She was a piece of livestock, a topic for a drunken wager. In the corner of the saloon, where the shadows clung thickest, a man sat alone. Cole Maddox had been nursing a single glass of whiskey for the better part of an hour, his back to the wall, his hat pulled low. He had watched Abigail enter, had noted the weary set of her shoulders and the way she held her head high despite it. He heard Drayton's words, and something inside him, a long dormant thing, stirred. The low murmur of the saloon, the clink of glasses, the coarse laughter, it all seemed to fade away. Slowly, deliberately. He placed his glass on the table. The sound was a small, definitive click in the growing noise. He pushed his chair back and stood, unfolding to his full height. He was not a large man, but he commanded space, his presence sucking the air out of the room. He moved from the shadows into the lamplight, his steps measured and silent. The laughter faltered as he approached Drayton's table. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cole stopped before Drayton, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the man. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. When he spoke, the words were low and steady, like stones settling at the bottom of a river. Yet they carried to every corner of the room. "I will take that bet." A nervous titter went through the crowd. Drayton, buoyed by whiskey and ego, puffed out his chest. Maddox finally decided to join the living. Which bet would that be, the stallion? Cole's gaze did not waver. It slid past Drayton and found Abigail, who stood rooted to the spot, her knuckles white where she gripped the plates. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the hard mask of his face softened, replaced by something ancient and sad. Then he turned his attention back to Drayton. "And a lifetime, Mr.." The silence that followed was absolute, a perfect, breathless vacuum. Every eye in the saloon was on him, then on Abigail, then back again. The meaning of his words settled, slow and heavy as a shroud. He had not just taken the bet, he had answered it. Then Drayton broke the spell. He threw his head back and roared with laughter, a booming, incredulous sound that shattered the tension. The rest of the saloon followed suit, the room exploding in a wave of disbelief and derision. The sound crashed over Abigail. A physical blow. Humiliation burned in her gut like acid. She dropped the plates, the crash barely audible over the noise. She strode forward, her vision blurred by angry tears. She did not see the mocking faces or the pointing fingers. She saw only the man who had, with 5 quiet words, stripped her of the last shred of dignity she possessed. She reached him, drew back her hand, and slapped him across the face. The sound of the slap was sharp as a gunshot in the sudden silence that followed. Cole Maddox did not flinch. He did not even blink. He absorbed the blow as if it were a gust of wind, a minor inconvenience. He slowly raised a hand to his cheek, not in pain, but as if to mark the moment. Then he looked at Abigail one last time, his expression impossible to decipher. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible dip of his head, a gesture that was nearly a tip of his hat. And then he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving behind a room full of gawking men and one woman whose life he had just irrevocably broken. The news of the bet spread through Dust Valley faster than a prairie fire. By sundown, every man, woman, and child knew the story. It was told over dinner tables, whispered over fences, and dissected in the general store. The tale grew with each telling. Cole Maddox, the dangerous recluse, had publicly declared his intention to marry Abigail Hensley, the town spinster, all on a drunken wager. For Cole, the incident cemented his reputation as an unpredictable outsider, a man touched by madness or grief or both. He became the fool who'd court a spinster. Men laughed at him, but never to his face. He went about his business as if nothing had happened, riding out to his ranch, his face a stony mask. He offered no explanation, No denial, no comment whatsoever. His silence was a canvas onto which the town painted its own lurid conclusions. For Abigail, the consequences were immediate and devastating. She became the town's premier joke. The pity she had once endured was replaced by open mockery. Women looked at her with a mixture of scorn and glee, glad that it was her life, and not theirs, that had become a public spectacle. Men winked at her as she passed, their eyes lingering with a new, lewd familiarity. She was no longer a woman. She was a wager, a prize to be won, or a burden to be endured. Her job at the Blue Cactus became unbearable, each customer's smirk a fresh wound. She went home each night to the small, shadowed house she shared with her father, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her until it was hard to breathe. The slap, her one act of defiance, was now remembered as the desperate act of a woman who had just been bought and paid for. In the quiet darkness of her room, she cursed the name of Cole Maddox, the silent, ghost-eyed man who had ruined her with a kindness that felt more like cruelty than any insult ever could. The days that followed were a lesson in the anatomy of shame. Abigail learned that it had a sound, the sudden hushing of conversation when she entered the general store. It had a texture, the hot, crawling feeling on her skin as eyes followed her down the dusty street. It had a taste, the bitterness that rose in her throat when she heard a snicker from a group of cowboys. Her name was no longer her own. It was a punchline. The town of Dust Valley, which had once merely pitied her, now feasted on her humiliation. It was a cruel and unifying sport. Her employer at the Blue Cactus, a man named Henderson with a perpetually worried expression and a thinning mustache, held out for 3 days. On the 4th day, he called her into his small, cluttered office. He would not meet her eye, focusing instead on a stain on his desktop that he polished with his thumb. "Abigail," he began, his voice low. "You have been a hard worker, a good worker." She stood straight, her hands clasped behind her back, and waited. She knew what was coming. "It is just business is business. The talk, it is not good for the diner. The families, you understand. They are saying things. They do not want their children hearing such coarse talk." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading for her to make this easy. "The scandal is just too loud. I have to let you go." She did not cry. She did not argue. The fight had been leached out of her by the constant, grinding pressure of the past 72 hours. She simply nodded once, a small, tight movement of her head. "I understand. Mr. Henderson." She collected the few coins she was owed and walked out of the Blue Cactus for the last time. The midday sun was a hammer blow, the street a stage for her final disgrace. She had no job, no prospects, and a name that was now synonymous with a drunken bet. As she stood blinking in the harsh light, a wagon pulled up beside her. It was a simple buckboard, sturdy and unadorned, pulled by 2 strong-looking bays. The man holding the reins was Cole Maddox. He did not look at her at first, his gaze fixed somewhere down the long, empty street. He wore the same clothes he always wore, durable trousers, a plain shirt, and his low-brimmed hat. He looked as if he had been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. "Heard you lost your position," he said, his voice as flat and dry as the earth beneath them. Abigail's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I am sure you did," she said, her voice laced with venom. "The whole town is enjoying the show you directed." He turned his head then and looked at her. She expected to see mockery in his eyes, or perhaps a flicker of the same cruel amusement she saw on every other face. But she saw neither. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, and they were filled with an expression she could not name, a deep and abiding weariness that seemed to echo her own. There was no humor there. There was no malice. There was only a profound and unsettling sincerity. "I need someone to keep the books at the ranch," he said, ignoring her accusation. "And to cook. My men are tired of my cooking." He paused. "You need to get out of this town." She stared at him, speechless. The sheer audacity of it, the simple practical nature of the offer, was disarming. She had prepared for a fight, for an exchange of insults. for anything but this. She thought it was another joke, a new, more elaborate cruelty designed to break what little spirit she had left. "You mock me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "You destroyed my life for a laugh, and now you want to hire me as your housekeeper." "I am not mocking you," he said, and his gaze was so steady, so devoid of trickery, that she found herself, against all reason, believing him. This is a proposition, a way out, for both of us. She searched his face for the lie, the hidden barb, but all she saw was a man who looked as trapped as she felt. The thought was so absurd it made her head spin. "Come to the lawyer's office in an hour," he said. "We will draw up an agreement." Before she could form a reply, he clucked to his horses and the wagon rolled away, leaving her standing alone in a cloud of fine red dust. An hour later, she found herself sitting in the musty office of Bartholomew Jones, the town's only lawyer. Cole Maddox sat opposite her, his hat in his hands. The lawyer, a small man with ink stains on his fingers, read from a piece of paper in a dry, rustling voice. The terms were brutally simple. They would be married. The marriage would be in name only, a contract to be dissolved after a period of 6 months. During that time, she would live at his ranch and serve as his bookkeeper and cook. In return, upon the signing of the marriage certificate, he would pay in full the outstanding debt on her father's house, the debt that had cost him his forge and his pride. It was a business transaction, her freedom from the town in exchange for 6 months of her life, her father's security in exchange for her name. She looked at Cole, but he was studying the floorboards, his face a mask. There was no romance in the room, no hint of affection. There was only the quiet desperation of two people making a deal with the devil they knew to escape the one they did not. She thought of her father, his slumped shoulders and vacant eyes. She thought of the whispers and the leers that would follow her for the rest of her days in Dust Valley. She picked up the pen. Her signature was a thin, spidery thing, the final surrender. The news of the marriage agreement created a fresh wave of speculation. The first bet was settled, and now a new one began. How long would she last? The odds were not in her favor. A week, some said a month at most. The idea that this strange, silent man and the proud, broken woman could forge any kind of life together was the most ridiculous thing the town had ever heard. The day she left Dust Valley, a fine, gritty rain was falling, the kind that did not wash the world clean but only turned the dust to mud. She had packed her few belongings in a single carpet bag. Her father had hugged her, his embrace clumsy and full of unspoken words. She climbed onto the seat of the buckboard beside Cole, not looking at the faces that peered from windows and doorways, their curiosity a palpable force. They rode out of town in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves. The rain began to fall a little harder, cold and persistent. A shiver ran through her thin dress. Without a word, Cole shrugged out of his heavy canvas coat and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was surprising, solid and real. It smelled of leather, horses, and the faint, clean scent of the open prairie. It was the first act of kindness she had received in what felt like a lifetime, and it was so unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes. She turned her head away, hiding them from him, and huddled deeper into the coat's warmth. The Maddox Ranch was miles from town, set in a wide valley that was starkly beautiful. A long, low main house stood under the shade of 2 ancient cottonwoods, its porch weathered to a silver gray. A large barn, several corrals, and a few smaller outbuildings were spread out around it. It was vast, quiet, and strangely empty. As they pulled up, a couple of ranch hands emerged from the barn, their faces weathered and incurious. They nodded to Cole, their eyes flicking to her for only a moment before they turned back to their work. There were no introductions. Cole led her into the house. It was bigger than she had expected, with a large main room, a kitchen, and several other rooms leading off a long hallway. But it was a house with no soul. The furniture was sparse and functional. A thick layer of dust covered every surface. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floors, no curtains on the windows. It was the home of a man who did not live, but only existed. "This room will be yours," he said, indicating a door. "Mine is at the other end of the hall. The kitchen is there. The ledgers are on the desk in the main room. Do what you see fit." And that was it. He turned and left her there, his boots echoing on the bare wood floors before the sound was swallowed by the house's oppressive silence. That night, she made a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They ate at the long dining table in silence. When they were finished, he took his plate to the kitchen, thanked her quietly for the meal, and walked out the front door. She assumed he had gone to his room. She cleaned the kitchen, the familiar work a small comfort in this strange new world. Exhausted, she went to her own room and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke hours later, thirsty. The house was utterly dark and silent. She made her way to the kitchen for a glass of water, and on her way back, she noticed that the door to his room was ajar. A sliver of moonlight cut across the floor. On an impulse, she pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, its coverlet undisturbed. He had never been in it. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Where was he? Had he left her alone in this vast, empty place? She crept to the front door and peered out into the moonlit yard. And then she saw it. A single lantern cast a pale, golden glow from the open doorway of the barn. Drawn by a curiosity that was stronger than her fear, she pulled his coat back over her shoulders and slipped out of the house. The night air was cold and clean. She moved silently across the yard, the soft earth muffling her footsteps. As she reached the barn, the sweet, earthy smell of hay and horses washed over her. She peered inside. In a clean, empty stall, on a thick pile of fresh straw, lay Cole Maddox. He was asleep, one arm thrown over his eyes, fully dressed except for his boots and his hat. He had a single blanket thrown over him. He was not in the house, in the master's bed. He slept here, in the barn, with his horses. Abigail stood in the shadows, watching the slow, even rise and fall of his chest. The town called him a dangerous man, a gunslinger, a fool. They had made him into a monster, a caricature. But the man she saw before her was something else entirely. He was a man who chose a bed of straw over a soft mattress. A man who gave a stranger his coat and offered her a safe harbor in his empty home. A man who treated her not as a wager or a woman to be owned, but with a quiet, absolute respect that she had never known. For the first time since she had slapped his face in the saloon, the hard shell of her anger and prejudice began to crack. She had thought she knew who Cole Maddox was, standing there in the quiet of the barn. She realized she knew nothing at all. Life on the Maddox ranch was governed by the sun and the needs of the horses. It was a rhythm Abigail learned quickly, for it was an honest one, stripped of all pretense. She rose in the pre-dawn chill, the air still carrying the scent of sage and cool earth, and started the fire in the kitchen stove. The first pot of coffee was always the strongest, a concession to the hard life of the ranch hands. A small group of wiry, quiet men who ate breakfast before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mesas. They spoke little to her, but their nods of gratitude for a hot meal were more genuine than any compliment she had ever received in Dust Valley. Cole was always the first one up and the last to settle. He would appear at the kitchen door as the sky turned from black to bruised purple, taking a mug of coffee without a word, and disappearing back into the morning mist toward the corrals. Her days were divided between the house and the ledgers. The house was a battle against the ever-present dust, a fight to bring a semblance of life to the empty rooms. The ledgers were a different kind of challenge, a chaotic mess of scrawled notes, receipts, and IOUs that Cole had stuffed into a wooden box. She spent hours at the big desk in the main room, her pen scratching methodically, imposing order on his disordered finances. She discovered he was a shrewd trader of horses, but a terrible manager of money. often selling a prize stallion for a pittance to a family who needed a good plow horse. In the afternoons, she found herself drawn to the corrals. At first, she only watched from the porch, but the raw power and grace of the animals called to her. Cole was a master with them, his silence a language they seemed to understand. He never broke a horse with force, but with a patience that was almost hypnotic, a slow dance of trust between man and beast. One afternoon, he saw her watching and gave a slight jerk of his head toward a gentle-looking mare. It was an invitation. Hesitantly, she joined him. His instructions were sparse, more gesture than word. He showed her how to brush the horse, how to check its hooves, how to properly cinch a saddle. He taught her the way he did everything, with a quiet economy of motion that wasted nothing. A week into her new life, feeling a flicker of confidence, she tried to saddle the mare by herself. The horse, sensing her inexperience, shied suddenly. Abigail, off balance, tumbled backward into the soft dirt of the corral. The fall was more surprising than painful, knocking the wind from her lungs. Before she could even process what had happened, Cole was there. He knelt beside her, his face for once showing a crack in its stoic facade, a flicker of concern in his gray eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, pushing herself up on her elbows, her face hot with embarrassment. "I am fine, just my pride is bruised." He extended a hand to help her up. She took it without thinking. His hand was calloused and hard, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. As he pulled her to her feet, his fingers brushed against the bare skin of her wrist. A jolt, sharp and unexpected as a spark from a flint, shot up her arm. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental touch, but in the silent world they inhabited, it felt as loud as a shout. She pulled her hand away quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. He seemed not to notice, his attention already back on the horse, his voice calm as he soothed the nervous animal. But Abigail felt the ghost of his touch all afternoon, a small point of warmth on her skin that she could not ignore. She learned more about him not from his own mouth, but from the oldest ranch hand, a man named Jedediah, who had a face like a dried apple and kind, watery eyes. One evening, as he was mending a bridle on the porch, he began to talk. He spoke of Cole's arrival in the valley, a man running from a past he never mentioned, but Jedediah had heard the story from a drover who had known him before. He told her about Eleanor, Cole's intended, a woman with hair the color of corn silk and a laugh like wind chimes. They were to be married in Santa Fe. She was on a train, coming to meet him, when it was held up by outlaws. There was a gunfight. A stray bullet had found her. Jedediah said Cole had hunted down the men responsible, one by one. And when he was finished, he was not the same man. He came to Dust Valley to disappear, to surround himself with the silence that now filled his own soul. Listening to the old man's story, Abigail began to understand the deep well of sorrow that lay behind Cole's gray eyes. He was not just a quiet man. He was a man who had had the words stolen from him by grief. A few days later, she was struggling with the ledgers. The ink was faint, and her pencil was worn down to a tiny stub. Cole came into the room to retrieve a canteen and saw her frustration. He watched her for a moment, then left without a word. He returned a few minutes later and placed a small object on the desk beside her hand. It was a pencil, but unlike any she had ever seen, it was made of polished silver, slender and elegant, with a delicate chased pattern on its surface. It was a beautiful, expensive thing, completely out of place in the rustic simplicity of the ranch. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Thought this might work better," he said, his gaze directed at the ledger. "Not at her. It is for someone with handwriting better than mine." It was the closest he had ever come to giving her a compliment. She picked up the pencil, its weight cool and solid in her hand. It was more than a writing instrument. It was an acknowledgement, a sign that he saw her, not just as a cook or a housekeeper, but as a person with skills he respected. "Thank you," she whispered, but he was already gone. Their monthly trip to town for supplies was an ordeal she dreaded. As their wagon rolled down the main street, she could feel the eyes on them, could hear the whispers that followed in their wake. In the general store, a group of women, led by the banker's wife, deliberately turned their backs on her. As Abigail was paying for a sack of flour, the woman sniffed loudly and said to her friend, "I wonder what the price is for a husband these days. Some people seem to get a bargain." The cruel remark hung in the air. Abigail felt the familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks. In the past, she would have shrunk away, her eyes on the floor. But something had changed in her. The clean air of the ranch, the honest labor, the quiet respect of the man beside her. They had all worked to rebuild the spine that the town had tried so hard to break. She turned slowly and faced the woman. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it cut through the murmuring of the store. "The price, madam, is a good deal less than the cost of a sour disposition and a venomous tongue. And it is a price I am sure you know well." A collective gasp went through the store. The banker's wife turned a shade of mottled red. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from beside her, Abigail heard a low sound. She glanced at Cole. He was looking down at a barrel of nails, but a slow smile was spreading across his face. It was a small, rare thing, a slight lifting at the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his entire expression. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated approval. He met her eyes for a second, and in that shared glance, she felt a bond form, a silent alliance against the world. That night, a chill had settled into the valley air. After dinner, instead of disappearing to the barn, Cole built a fire in the large stone fireplace in the main room. The flames crackled and danced, casting a warm, flickering light that pushed back the shadows. Abigail sat in a worn armchair, mending one of Cole's shirts, and he sat opposite her, cleaning a piece of tack. The silence between them was different this time. Not empty, but comfortable, companionable. Hesitantly, she began to speak, telling him a small story from her childhood about a stray dog she had once befriended. To her surprise, he responded with a memory of his own, of learning to fish with his father in a creek back in Missouri. They talked for hours, their voices low, sharing the simple, ordinary stories that make up a life. It was not a conversation of deep secrets or grand confessions, but it felt more intimate than either. Later, he went to his saddlebags and pulled out a harmonica. He sat back down by the fire and began to play. The tune was simple and sad, a melody that spoke of lonely trails and long nights under the stars. It was a song full of a gentle sorrow, a song that told her more about his heart than words ever could. She listened, her needle still, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The season turned, and the autumn rains began. One night, a ferocious storm rolled in from the mountains, a tempest of driving rain and howling wind. They were woken by the sound of splintering wood and the terrified whinnying of horses. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene outside. The creek that ran through the property had breached its banks, and a torrent of brown water was surging through the lower pasture, threatening to flood the main barn. Without a word, they both pulled on their boots and coats and ran out into the storm. The ranch hands were already there, fighting to get the horses out of the stalls and onto higher ground. The water was already knee-deep and rising fast. It was chaos, a desperate struggle against the fury of the storm. Abigail worked alongside them, her dress soaked and heavy with mud, her hair plastered to her face. She led panicked horses through the swirling water, her voice a low, calming murmur. Cole was everywhere at once, a pillar of strength in the maelstrom, his quiet commands cutting through the roar of the wind. They worked through the night, a silent, efficient team, their bodies aching, their hands raw. As the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds, the storm finally passed. They stood, soaked and exhausted, in the muddy, debris-strewn yard, the horses safe on the hillside. They had saved them all. Later, as she sat by the kitchen fire, wrapped in a dry blanket and sipping hot coffee. A thought occurred to her. She looked at Cole, who was staring into the flames, his face streaked with mud, his expression weary but content. She realized that in all the weeks she had been at the ranch, through all the shared work and quiet moments, he had never once mentioned the bet. He had never alluded to the saloon, or to the reason she was there. It was as if that ugly, humiliating moment had been erased, washed away like the debris in the flood. He had treated their arrangement not as a wager, but as a solemn promise. It was as if he had forgotten the beginning, and she, for the first time, found herself wanting to believe that this, the life they were building in the dust and sweat and silence, was the only thing that was real. The fragile piece they had built was as delicate as a spider's web spun between two fence posts, shimmering and beautiful in the morning light, but easily torn. The quiet rhythm of the ranch had become the rhythm of Abigail's own heart, a steady, dependable beat that had soothed the frantic pulse of her fear. The silence between her and Cole was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken understanding. In his quiet presence, she had begun to feel not like a wager, but like a partner. The ghost of the saloon had faded, replaced by the solid reality of shared work and the warmth of a fire on a cold night. This peace was shattered on a blistering hot afternoon when the sky was a sheet of white metal and the air was still and heavy. A rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck that slowly resolved into a man on a fine-looking black horse. He rode with an arrogance that announced him long before he reached the ranch house. Abigail was on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl, and she knew him at once. Earl Drayton. He swung down from his horse, his expensive boots sinking into the dust of the yard. He wore a tailored coat and a string tie, looking absurdly out of place. He smelled of whiskey and pomade. His eyes, small and cunning, swept over the ranch with a proprietary air before landing on Abigail. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice oily. "Looks like the little mare has found a comfortable pasture." Abigail stood slowly, the bowl of peas held tight in her hands. "You are not welcome here, Mr. Drayton." Before he could reply, the door of the barn creaked open and Cole emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw Drayton and his body went still, every line of him hardening into something dangerous. He did not walk. He glided across the yard, his movements economical and deadly. "Drayton," Cole said. The name was a flat, cold stone. "Get off my land." Drayton's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. "Now, Maddox, is that any way to treat an old associate? I'm just here to collect on a debt. A friendly wager. You will recall. $500. You won the prize, after all." He winked at Abigail, a gesture so vile it made her stomach turn. "And I must say, she has cleaned up nicely." Cole was in front of him in 2 silent strides. He was shorter than Drayton, but at that moment, he seemed to tower over him. "There is no debt," he said, his voice a low growl that was more threatening than any shout. "I settled it the day after. Now leave, before I forget that this is my home and not some back alley where men like you belong." The threat, unspoken but perfectly clear, hung in the hot, still air. Drayton's bravado wavered. He took a half-step back, his eyes flicking nervously toward the colt that rode low on Cole's hip. He forced a laugh, a harsh, grating sound. "No need for unpleasantness," he said, backing toward his horse. He swung himself into the saddle, gathering the reins. He looked down at Cole with renewed scorn, his courage restored by the height advantage. Then his gaze shifted to Abigail, and his expression turned to one of pure malice. He had lost his confrontation with the man, so he would wound the woman. "Do not let him fool you, sweetheart," Drayton sneered, his voice carrying across the yard. "You really think he married you for your charming personality? It was a wager, and a man like Maddox always honors his bets." He spurred his horse, galloping away in a cloud of dust, his laughter trailing behind him like a poisoned dart. Abigail stood frozen on the porch, Drayton's words echoing in the sudden silence. It was a wager. The phrase pierced the fragile shell of her newfound security, and all the old shame and humiliation came pouring back in. She looked at Cole. He was watching her, his face an unreadable mask, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the hard set of his shoulders. He had not denied it. He had not said, "That is a lie." He had only told the man to leave. The rest of the day passed in a haze of misery. The comfortable silence between them was now a chasm of doubt. Every time he looked at her, she wondered if he was assessing his winnings. Every quiet act of courtesy felt like a charade, part of the long, cruel game he was playing. The silver pencil on the desk seemed to mock her, a pretty trinket to placate the prize. That evening, she was in the main room, trying to force herself to work on the ledgers, to bring order to the numbers when her own world had dissolved into chaos. Her hands were trembling as she sorted through the box of receipts. And then she found it, a small, folded piece of paper, tucked into an old bill of sale. It was a note, written in Drayton's florid script. It was an IOU, for the sum of $100, payment on the Hensley wager, signed Earl Drayton. Beneath it, in Cole's spare, angular handwriting, was a single word: paid. The air left her lungs in a rush. It was not $500, but it was real. It was proof. He had paid the man. He had honored the bet. Drayton's words were true. She was nothing more than a debt settled, a bargain fulfilled. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp, cold blade twisting in her heart. She waited until late that night. The ranch hands were asleep in the bunkhouse. The only light in the house came from the single lamp on the desk where she sat, the damning piece of paper held in her hand. She heard Cole enter the house, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He came into the main room, likely on his way to the barn. He stopped when he saw her sitting there in the dark. "Abigail." She stood up and held out the paper. Her hand did not shake. It was perfectly steady. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a dead, empty thing. He took the paper and unfolded it, his face cast in shadow by the lamplight. He read it, and she saw him flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He was silent for a long time, the paper held loosely in his hand. He did not look at her. He looked at the floor, at the wall, at the darkness outside the window, anywhere but at her. The silence stretched, pulling taut between them. She needed him to deny it, to explain it, to rage against the lie, but he did none of those things. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a weariness that went bone deep. "It started as a bet," he said quietly. It did not stay that way. The words were meant to be a comfort, but all she heard was the confession. It started as a bet. The rest was just noise, an excuse, a lie to soothe his own conscience. The last fragile thread of hope inside her snapped. She turned from him, the tears she had held back for so long blurring her vision. She walked past him, out of the room, down the hall to her own. She did not slam the door. She closed it softly, a final, quiet act of surrender. She did not know how long she sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness, the storm of her grief and rage silent and contained. But outside, another storm was brewing. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that grew into a piercing shriek. It rattled the windows in their frames and sent fine grains of sand seeping through the cracks. A dust storm. And in that moment, a desperate, reckless idea took hold. She could not stay here. She could not face him in the morning. She could not live another day as a man's paid wager. She had to leave. She had to run. She did not take her bag. She did not take his coat. She took nothing. She slipped out of her room, through the dark, silent house, and out the back door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, a solid wall of moving air and sand that tore at her clothes and stung her eyes. It was a blind, chaotic world, a reflection of the turmoil in her own soul. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. She stumbled into the roaring darkness, The ranch house swallowed behind her in an instant and ran. Cole knew something was wrong the moment he heard her door close. The softness of the sound was more alarming than a slam would have been. He stood in the main room, the IOU still in his hand, a crushing weight of regret settling over him. He was a fool with words, a clumsy, silent man who knew how to gentle a horse but not how to soothe a wounded heart. He had told the truth, but it was a truth that was also a lie. He had not known how to explain the rest. He went to her door and listened. There was no sound. He knocked softly. Abigail. Only the rising howl of the wind answered him, a cold dread, a feeling he had not known since the day he had heard the news about the train, seeped into his bones. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The back door of the house was swinging in the wind. He did not hesitate. He ran to the barn, his mind a maelstrom of fear. He saddled his fastest horse, a powerful buckskin that was not afraid of the storm. He wrapped a kerchief over the lower half of his face and rode out into the teeth of the gale. It was like riding into a living thing, a malevolent entity of sand and fury. He could see no more than a few feet in front of him. He called her name, his voice ripped from his lips by the wind. He could only trust his horse and his instincts, casting a desperate, spiraling search pattern out from the ranch. He found her an hour later, a small, dark shape huddled at the base of a rocky outcrop. She had collapsed, a crumpled heap of exhaustion and despair. The sand was already beginning to drift over her. He leaped from his horse and ran to her side. She was unconscious, her face pale and cold, her lips cracked. He lifted her into his arms, her body a dead weight. She was so light. As he straightened up, a sharp branch, whipped by the wind, tore a deep gash in his forearm, but he barely felt it. He got her onto the horse, mounting behind her, holding her tight against his chest. The ride back was a slow, brutal fight against the storm. A desperate prayer whispered into the wind. He carried her into the house and laid her gently on her bed. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity. He washed the dust from her face with a damp cloth. He trickled a little water between her lips from a spoon. He covered her with every blanket he could find. He sat in a chair beside her bed all night, watching, waiting, as the storm raged outside and a different kind of storm raged within him. Abigail awoke to a world of stillness and pale gray light. The wind had died. The house was silent. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then the memory of the night before came rushing back, a wave of pain and humiliation. She turned her head on the pillow. The room was empty. She pushed herself up slowly, her body aching and weak. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her knees trembling. She walked out into the main room. It was filled with the soft light of a new day. Cole was standing by the window, his back to her. The storm had passed. He turned as he heard her footsteps, and his face was etched with exhaustion and relief. He started to say something, but then she saw it. He was holding his left arm, and a crude, blood-soaked bandage was wrapped around his forearm. As she watched, he winced and began to fumble with the knot, trying to tighten it with one hand and his teeth. He had been hurt. He had been hurt saving her. The sight of his quiet, clumsy struggle with his own wound was a more eloquent defense than any words could ever be. A man did not ride into a deadly storm, did not suffer injury for a mere wager. The certainty of her anger and betrayal began to waver, and in its place, a small, fragile seed of doubt began to sprout. It was not forgiveness, it was not trust, but it was a crack in the wall of her misunderstanding, a tiny fissure through which a single ray of light could pass. The days that followed the storm were quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a space of comfort, but a field of tension, charged with the things they had not said. Abigail tended to the gash on Cole's arm, cleaning and binding it with a careful, gentle touch that was a silent apology. He accepted her care with a stillness that was a silent forgiveness. They moved around each other like two planets that had been knocked from their orbits, aware of the other's pull but uncertain of the path forward. He watched her as she worked, a new, raw emotion in his eyes, and she found her gaze drawn to him, to the way the light caught the gray in his hair, to the strength in his calloused hands. The truth of the bet lay between them, a wounded thing they were both afraid to touch. They had fallen into this fragile truce for a week when the real fire came. It came in the dead of night, a thief in the darkness. Abigail was woken by a sound that did not belong, a low, hungry crackling that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the house. Then came the smell, acrid and sharp, the smell of burning hay and old wood. She threw off her blankets and ran to the window. The world outside was bathed in a terrifying, flickering orange light. The barn was on fire. A wave of cold terror washed over her. The horses! She ran from her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Cole was already in the main room, pulling on his boots, his face a grim mask in the demonic glow. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, she saw not a cold recluse, but a man about to lose the only thing he had left to love. "Stay in the house," he commanded, his voice a low rasp. "Call the hands." He was out the door before she could answer, a dark silhouette against a wall of flame. She screamed for the ranch hands, her voice thin against the roar of the fire, and saw them spilling from the bunkhouse. Then she turned back to the barn. Cole had disappeared inside, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. It was no longer about the ranch, or the horses, or the life they had built. It was about him, the thought of him in that inferno, of the world without his quiet, steady presence, was a black, bottomless void that opened up beneath her. The bet, the town, her pride, it all burned away to ash, leaving only one terrifyingly simple truth. She could not lose him. She ran. She did not know what she could do, but she knew she could not stand by and watch. The heat was a solid thing, a physical blow that seared her lungs and brought tears to her eyes. The noise was a deafening symphony of destruction, the roar of the flames, the shriek of terrified horses, the crash of falling timbers. She reached the massive barn door and peered into the hell beyond. Smoke and embers filled the air, a swirling, choking chaos. She could see the ranch hands working frantically to lead the panicked horses out of the stalls at the far end. But the main section of the barn, the one closest to her, was a furnace, and in the middle of it, she saw him. He was fighting to free the last horse, his prize buckskin, whose leg was trapped under a heavy, burning beam. He was straining against the wood, his muscles corded, his face black with soot, his injured arm bleeding freely again. As she watched, a section of the hayloft above him groaned, sagged, and then collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. The horse screamed and pulled free in a final, desperate surge of terror, galloping out into the night. But Cole was knocked to the ground by a falling timber, and he lay still. "No," Abigail whispered. The word was a prayer, a denial, a plea. She did not think. She plunged into the smoke and heat, her thin nightgown offering no protection. The world was a blur of orange and black. She reached him, her hands grabbing the rough fabric of his shirt. He was heavy, an anchor in a sea of fire. She pulled, her muscles screaming in protest. "Cole!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Get up!" She pulled again, with a strength born of pure terror. He stirred, groaning, and she managed to drag him, stumbling backward, toward the door, away from the worst of the flames. They collapsed together in the yard as the main roof of the barn gave way with a sound like thunder, sending a column of fire and sparks into the night sky. She knelt over him, her hands on his face, his chest. He was alive. He was breathing. He was covered in soot and blood, a burn on his shoulder, a gash on his head. But he was alive. Tears of relief streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She leaned down, her forehead pressed against his, and held him. her body shielding his from the embers that rained down around them. "Do not you die on me," she sobbed, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "Do not you die on me, you damn cowboy." The ranch hands helped her carry him into the house. They laid him on his own bed, the bed he never used. For the first time, the fire in the barn eventually burned itself out, a glowing, skeletal ruin against the coming dawn. But Abigail did not see it. Her world had shrunk to the size of this room, to the man lying so terribly still on the bed. She cleaned his wounds with gentle, trembling hands. She bathed his face, his neck, his arms. She sat by his side, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, her heart keeping time with every painful breath he took. He awoke hours later as the sun was casting long, pale fingers of light across the floor. He blinked, his eyes trying to focus. He saw her face, inches from his, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a raw, unguarded emotion he had never seen before. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice a dry, scratchy thing. "I am here," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. He looked around the room, at the ceiling, then back at her, confusion clouding his features. The fire. "It is out," she said softly. "The horses are safe, all of them." He closed his eyes for a moment, a wave of relief passing over his face. Then he opened them again, and they were clear, fixed on her. The fire had burned away the last of his silence, the last of his reticence. "The bet," he said, his voice stronger now. "It was just an excuse." She stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. "Drayton and his kind," he went on, his words coming in a slow, pained rush. "They were laughing at you, and I looked at you, standing there, so proud and so alone, and I felt something I had not felt since Eleanor. It was a fool's move, a clumsy way to get to you, to break you free of them. I went to Drayton the next morning and paid him the $100. I told him the bet was off. I did not care about the money. I did not care about the wager." He coughed, a dry, racking sound, and she held a glass of water to his lips. He took a small sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I could not stop thinking about you," he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "Even when the bet was over, I saw you every day in town, and I wanted to talk to you, but I did not have the words, so I made that stupid, loud gesture in the saloon. I wanted you out of there. I wanted you here, safe." The truth, when it finally came, was so simple and so profound that it shattered her. The tears that had been threatening all night finally fell, hot and silent. She cried for the misunderstanding, for the pain she had carried, for the lonely, broken man who had used a foolish bet as a shield for his own wounded heart. She leaned down, and her lips found his. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of sorrow and relief. It tasted of smoke and ash, of blood and tears. It was the first honest thing that had ever passed between them, a raw and beautiful confession in the aftermath of destruction. When they finally broke apart, he raised a trembling, soot-stained hand and touched her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. His gray eyes were full of a light she had never seen before. "You are no man's bet, Abigail," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my choice." The words were an absolution. They were the key that unlocked the last cage around her heart. She was not a prize. She was a choice, his choice. Later, as the ranch hands worked to salvage what they could from the smoldering ruins, he pulled her close. The pain and the fear of the night receded, replaced by a quiet, powerful certainty. What they did next was not a surrender to passion, but a deliberate act of creation. It was a gentle, tender coming together, a quiet exploration in the stillness of the afternoon. It was a silent promise to rebuild, not just the barn, but their own lives, together, from the ashes. It was a slow, sacred act of finding a home in one another, a sanctuary born of fire and forgiveness. The morning broke pale and bruised, the sun rising on a landscape of ruin. Where the great barn had stood, there was now only a blackened skeleton of charred timbers, a gaping wound on the land. The air was thick with the ghost of the fire, a bitter, chemical smell that clung to everything. Inside the house, the silence was heavy, punctuated by the soft crackle of the fire in the kitchen stove. Cole lay in the master bed, his shoulder and arm bandaged, a feverish glint in his eyes. The burn was deep, and the exhaustion from the fight had settled into his bones, leaving him weak and in pain. Abigail, moving on a reserve of nervous energy she did not know she possessed, took charge. She had spent the last few hours of darkness tending to him, and now, with the dawn, she turned her attention to the rest of the ranch. She gathered the 3 ranch hands in the kitchen. Jedediah and the 2 younger men looked tired and defeated, their gazes drifting toward the smoldering ruins. "Jedediah," she began, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "I need you to take stock of the horses. Check each one for burns or injuries from the smoke. The rest of the tack was lost, so we will need a full inventory of what we need to replace." She turned to the younger men. "I want the 2 of you to start clearing a space near the north pasture. We will need to build a temporary shelter for the horses. Use any salvageable timber you can find, but be careful." They stared at her for a moment, surprised by the authority in her voice. Then Jedediah, after a long look at her determined face, gave a slow, respectful nod. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the title felt different this time. Not a formality, but a recognition. The men left, their shoulders a little squarer, a sense of purpose replacing their despair. Abigail spent the morning moving between the house and the yard. She made a nourishing broth for Cole, forcing him to drink it. She organized a bucket brigade to douse the last of the embers. She was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, her mind sharp and focused. The woman who had been broken by whispers and scorn was gone, burned away in the fire. In her place stood the mistress of a ranch on the brink of ruin, and she would not let it fall. Cole watched her from the bed, and later from a chair he had insisted on moving to the porch. He saw the way the men looked to her for direction, and the way she gave it, without hesitation or doubt. He saw her face, smudged with soot, her brow furrowed in concentration, and he felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost hurt. This was the woman he had seen standing in the saloon, the one with the steel in her spine. The fire had not revealed her strength. It had only burned away everything that was concealing it. Around midday, a wagon and a few riders appeared on the road from town. It was not help. It was a delegation of gawkers, come to see the disaster for themselves. The banker's wife was there, along with some of the men who had been in the saloon that first day. They stood at a distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and smug satisfaction. "Looks like Maddox's luck has finally run out," one of the men said, his voice carrying on the still air. The banker's wife sniffed. "It is what happens when you live a godless life. This is judgment." Abigail, who had been directing the placement of a new watering trough, walked slowly toward them, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped at the edge of the yard, her feet planted firmly on the scorched earth. "If you have come to offer condolences, they are not needed," she said, her voice even. "If you have come to offer help, it is not wanted from you. And if you have come to gloat, I suggest you finish your business and leave my property." The banker's wife drew herself up. "Your property, I believe this is still the Maddox Ranch. Is it not, or has the price of your arrangement gone up?" The insult, so petty and so cruel in the face of their devastation, should have wounded her. Instead, it filled her with a cold, clear anger. She looked past the woman, her gaze sweeping over all of them, the silent jury of Dust Valley. "We will rebuild," she said, and her voice rang with a conviction that startled them into silence. "With or without your blessing." She turned her back on them then and walked away, leaving them standing in the dust. From his chair on the porch, Cole watched her go, and a slow, painful smile touched his lips. He had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. In the days that followed, the work of rebuilding began in earnest. But with the smoldering ruins of the barn came a new awareness of their vulnerability. Drayton was still out there, a poison that had yet to be drawn. One afternoon, as his shoulder began to heal, Cole found Abigail in the kitchen. He held out his own Colt, the one he had worn for years. "You need to learn how to use this," he said simply. She looked at the weapon, a thing of dark, heavy metal that felt alien in her world of books and ledgers. But she saw the seriousness in his eyes, and she knew he was right. They walked out to a clearing behind the house. He set up a row of empty tin cans on a fence post. His arm was still in a sling, so his movements were slow and deliberate. He showed her how to hold the pistol, how to stand, how to breathe. He stood behind her, his body close to hers, his good hand covering hers on the grip, guiding her aim. His nearness was a distraction. His clean scent, the warmth of his body so close to her back, the low rumble of his voice in her ear. "Easy now," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "Do not fight it. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." She took a breath, held it, and squeezed. The gun bucked in her hand with a deafening roar, and the bullet kicked up a puff of dust a foot to the left of the cans. She flinched, startled by the violence of it. "Again," he said, his voice calm and steady. They practiced for an hour. He was a patient teacher, his instructions precise and quiet. She learned to control her breathing, to ignore the noise, to feel the weapon as an extension of her own will. Finally, she took aim at the last can, focused, and squeezed. There was a satisfying ping as the can flew off the fence post and spun through the air. She lowered the gun, her arm trembling slightly, a look of shocked triumph on her face. She turned to him, a wide, genuine smile breaking through her concentration. He was smiling too, that same rare, slow smile she had seen in the general store. "Guess I am not the only sharpshooter now," he said, his voice full of a warm pride that made her heart swell. The moment of triumph was short-lived. The next day, the mail rider brought a letter. It was from the bank in Santa Fe. Abigail opened it, her brow furrowed. As she read, the color drained from her face. "What is it?" Cole asked from the porch. She looked up, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "It is the loan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The one your father took out on this land, with the loss of the barn and the equipment. The bank is calling it in. We have 3 months to pay the entire balance, or they will foreclose." The news was a gut punch, a blow more devastating than the fire. They could rebuild a barn, but they could not create money out of thin air. They sat in silence for a long time as the sun began to set, the long shadows stretching across the yard like grasping fingers. Ruin, which they had fought back with their own hands, had returned in the form of a piece of paper. Abigail's mind raced. She thought of her father, of his despair when he lost his forge to the bankers. She would not let that happen to Cole. She would not let it happen to them. Her gaze drifted across the valley, to the small, scattered homesteads of the other families. Poor ranchers and farmers who had even less than they did. She thought of their children, who grew up knowing only the rhythm of the seasons and the hardship of the land, with no hope of education or a different life. And then an idea, fragile at first, but then growing with a fierce, brilliant light, began to form in her mind. She turned to Cole, her eyes shining with a new resolve. "We cannot fight the bank with money, because we do not have any," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But maybe we can fight them with something else, with a purpose." He looked at her, confused. "The children out here," she explained, leaning forward, her hands clasped together. "They have no school. They have no one to teach them to read or write. The church has a mission fund for establishing schools in remote territories. If we were to offer a part of our land, to build a small schoolhouse, to offer me as the teacher, we could petition the territorial diocese for a grant. It might not be enough to pay the whole loan, but it would show the bank that this ranch is more than just a piece of property. It is the heart of a community. It would be a reason for them to give us more time. He stared at her, a look of stunned admiration on his face. He was a man who thought in terms of horses and fences, of rain and drought. He would never have conceived of such a plan. It was a plan born of a different kind of strength, a strength of mind and heart. That night, they sat together at the big desk in the main room, the silver pencil she now cherished moving across a clean sheet of paper. The oil lamp cast a warm, intimate glow around them. She wrote, her handwriting clear and elegant, and he contributed, his practical knowledge of the land and the people providing the solid foundation for her eloquent appeal. At one point, he reached out to point to a sentence on the page, and his hand covered hers. They both froze. His hand was rough and calloused against her softer one. It was a simple, unconscious gesture, but it was more intimate than a kiss. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were partners, their hands, their minds, their futures joined together under the soft light of a single lamp, writing a new story for themselves, a story of hope, born from the ashes. While the petition to the church offered a fragile tendril of hope for the future, the poison of the past had not yet been purged from their lives. Justice, it turned out, moved slowly, but it did move. A week after the fire, the town sheriff rode out to the ranch, another man in tow. The second man was a scrawny cowhand from a neighboring spread who, on the night of the fire, had been tracking a stray calf. He had seen a rider galloping away from the direction of the Maddox Ranch moments before the glow appeared in the sky. He had recognized the man and his distinctive black horse. It was Earl Drayton. The initial wave of relief that washed over Abigail was quickly followed by a cold tide of dread. Drayton was arrested that afternoon, but in the small, desperate cage of a jail cell. His cunning mind went to work. When the sheriff questioned him, he did not deny being near the ranch. Instead, he wove a story, a venomous tapestry of lies designed to drag Cole down with him. He claimed that Cole, desperate for money to save his failing ranch, had hired him to set the fire so he could collect on an insurance policy. The argument they had in the yard, Drayton claimed, was about Cole refusing to pay him his share. The story was ludicrous, but Dust Valley was a town that preferred a simple villain to a complicated truth. Cole Maddox, the silent ex-gunslinger, the outsider, was a perfect fit for the role. The town, which had long viewed him with suspicion, now had a reason to justify its prejudice. The whispers that had followed him for years coalesced into a roar of condemnation. He was a criminal, an arsonist, a man who would burn his own home for a handful of silver. The tide of public opinion, which had briefly turned against Drayton, now swung back with a vengeance, and Cole was caught in its undertow. The trial was set for the following month. Cole was not jailed, but he was a prisoner nonetheless, confined to his ranch by the hostile stares and muttered accusations that met him any time he went near town. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, a shadow of the man who had smiled at her by the firelight. He was being tried and convicted not by a jury, but by the town he had tried so hard to leave behind. Abigail knew that Drayton's word against Cole's was a battle Cole could not win. The town wanted to believe the worst of him. She knew there was only one way to expose Drayton's lie, to provide a motive for his revenge that had nothing to do with money. She had to tell the truth, all of it. She waited until a few days before the trial. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, the air cool and clear. The skeletal remains of the barn were a constant, dark reminder of what they had lost. "I am going to testify," she said, her voice soft but firm. Cole turned to her, his face grim in the twilight. "No, you will not." "It is the only way," she insisted. "They need to know why Drayton hates you. They need to hear the real story." "The real story," he said, his voice rough with a pain she had never heard before. "The real story is a drunken bet in a saloon. The real story will only humiliate you. Abigail, I will not have you dragged through that mud again. Not for me." She reached out and placed her hand on his uninjured arm, her touch a gentle anchor. You rode into a sandstorm for me. Cole, you walked into a fire. You did not do it because of a bet. You did it because of who you are. Now, let me do this. Let me tell them who you are. Her eyes held his, steady and unwavering. I am not that woman in the saloon anymore. I am not afraid of their whispers. He looked at her for a long time, at the strength that shone from her, a light that seemed to burn brighter in the face of adversity. He finally gave a slow, reluctant nod. He was a man who knew how to fight with his hands, but he was learning, from her, how to fight with the truth. The trial was held in the town's meeting hall, a stuffy, wood-paneled room that was packed to the rafters. It seemed every soul in Dust Valley was there, their faces a sea of grim curiosity. Abigail sat beside Cole, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Drayton was at the opposite table, looking smug and confident, whispering to his lawyer. The proceedings began, and Drayton's lawyer painted a masterful picture of Cole as a desperate, violent man. He brought up Cole's past, the whispers of his life as a gunslinger, portraying him as a man for whom crime was a natural solution. The townspeople murmured their agreement, their prejudices confirmed and validated. When Drayton took the stand, he was smooth and convincing, his lies flowing as easily as water from a pump. He told his story of the business deal gone wrong, casting himself as the victim of Cole's treachery. Then it was Abigail's turn. As she walked to the witness stand, a hush fell over the room. Every eye was on her. She could feel their judgment, their pity, their scorn. She sat down, smoothed her dress, and looked not at the lawyer, but at the 12 men in the jury box, their faces impassive and weathered. The lawyer began his questioning, his voice dripping with condescension. But Abigail did not wait for his traps. She began to speak, her own voice clear and calm, and she told her story. She started with her life before the bet, a life of quiet desperation and simmering pride. She told them about that day in the saloon, not sparing herself the details of her own humiliation. She described the leering faces, the cruel laughter, and the 5 words from a silent stranger in the corner that had changed her life. The room was utterly silent now, the only sound the soft scratch of the court reporter's pen. She told them of Cole's proposal, of the contract, of her first days at the ranch. She spoke of his quiet respect, of his sleeping in the barn, of the way he had given her a home when her own town had cast her out. She told them about Drayton's visit, his demand for money, and the IOU she had found. As she spoke, the story of the town's villain began to unravel, and a new one, a story of a clumsy, grief-stricken man and a lonely, proud woman, began to take its place. She finished by looking directly at the jury. Earl Drayton did not set fire to that barn because of a business deal, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that was impossible to doubt. He did it for revenge, because Cole Maddox refused to treat me like a piece of property in a wager. He did it because he could not stand to see a man of honor stand by a woman he had wronged. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the silent room. She took a deep breath. A man's honor, she said, her gaze sweeping from the jury to the faces in the crowd, is not in the bet he makes, but in how he keeps his word. The trial was over. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found Earl Drayton guilty of arson. They found Cole Maddox innocent of all charges. For a moment, as the verdict was read, a wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over Abigail. She looked at Cole, and he was looking at her, his face stripped bare of all its masks, his eyes full of a gratitude and a love so profound it took her breath away. But the victory was a hollow one. As they left the meeting hall, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, the whispers began again. They were different this time, quieter, more insidious. She had saved him, but in doing so, she had laid the foundation of their life bare for all to see. The story was now twisted into a new shape. She was no longer the spinster who had been won in a bet. She was the clever, calculating woman who was living with a man for his money and his land. Her testimony was not seen as an act of love, but as an act of self-preservation, a way to protect her investment. That night, back at the ranch, the weight of what she had done, of the price of his freedom, settled over her. Cole saw the shadow in her eyes, the return of the weary sadness he had tried so hard to erase. "We should leave," he said quietly, his voice full of a pain that was not for himself, but for her. "We can sell the ranch, go somewhere new, Oregon, maybe somewhere no one knows us, somewhere you do not have to live with their judgment." He was willing to give it all up, the land that was his only sanctuary, the horses that were his only family. He was willing to do it for her, and in that selfless offer, she found the last piece of her own strength. She went to him and took his hands in hers. They were strong, calloused hands. Hands that had fought fires and soothed horses and held her in the darkness. "No," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "This is our home. Cole, we have faced fire and flood and the hatred of an entire town. I am not going to be run off by a few bitter gossips." She looked out at the rolling hills, golden in the fading light. "We leave. They win." A slow smile spread across his face, a real smile this time, full of relief and a love that was as solid and enduring as the land itself. "All right," he said, "we stay." They stood there for a long time, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. A new beginning, earned in a crucible of fire and judgment, lay before them. "It needs a new name," she said after a while. "The Maddox Ranch is not right anymore. It is more than just yours now." He looked at her, his eyes asking the question. "I was thinking," she said, a small, shy smile on her face, "of the Lifetime Ranch." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in the safety of their shared future, he kissed her not with desperation or relief, but with the slow, sweet promise of a lifetime. The first snows of the following year had long melted, and the land, which had been scarred by fire and judgment, had begun to heal. The seasons had turned, and with them, the fortunes of the ranch and the hearts of its inhabitants. Autumn arrived again, not with the fury of a storm, but with the gentle grace of golden light on turning cottonwood leaves. On the western edge of the property, where the pasture met the low, rolling hills, stood a new building. It was not a barn, but a small, sturdy schoolhouse made of new pine that still smelled of sawdust and the promise of a future. This was the fruit of their desperate plan, a testament to Abigail's vision and Cole's hard work. The letter to the diocese had been answered, not with a grant large enough to erase their debt, but with a smaller sum and a blessing, which proved to be just enough. It had bought them time with the bank, a reprieve born of the undeniable good they were creating. The Lifetime Ranch was no longer just a place for horses. It had become a place of hope. Abigail was the teacher. Every morning, a handful of children from the surrounding homesteads would arrive, some on foot, some on the backs of stubborn mules. They were shy, sunburnt children with dirt under their fingernails and a wild, untamed curiosity in their eyes. For them, Abigail opened up a world they had never known, a world of letters that formed words, and words that formed stories. She taught them sums and geography, her voice a patient, steady presence in the small, sunlit room. She was not just teaching them to read, she was teaching them to dream. Cole's role in this new enterprise was quieter, but no less essential. He cared for the horses, his own and the sad-looking creatures the children rode. But he also cared for the children. He was a silent, watchful guardian, a looming presence that was at first intimidating, but soon became a source of comfort. He would appear at midday to fix a broken fence rail or to fill the water barrel, and the children would watch him, their small faces full of awe. He never spoke much to them, but he would sometimes leave a small, intricately whittled bird or horse on the windowsill, a silent gift that spoke more than words ever could. His favorite time of day was the late afternoon, during the golden hour when the sun slanted low across the valley. turning the dust motes in the air to flecks of gold. The day's lessons would be over, and Abigail would be reading to the children from a book, her voice a low, melodic murmur that carried on the still air. Cole would often find himself at the fence that bordered the schoolhouse yard, his work forgotten for a few moments. He would lean against the top rail, his arms crossed, and just listen. He could not always make out the words of the story, but he did not need to. The sound of her voice was the only story he needed to hear. It was the sound of his own heart finally finding a place of peace. He would watch her, her face animated as she read, the firelight from the small schoolhouse stove catching the auburn highlights in her hair, and a feeling of such profound, quiet joy would fill him that it was almost a physical ache. Their own life had settled into a rhythm as gentle and dependable as the changing seasons. The house was a home now, filled with the smell of baking bread and the scent of the wildflowers she insisted on keeping in a jar on the kitchen table. The silence between them was no longer a space to be navigated, but a shared language of comfort. Their love was not a thing of grand declarations or passionate outbursts. It was 1,000 small, unspoken moments. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of coffee in the morning, just the way she liked it. It was in the way she would mend a tear in his shirt before he had even noticed it was there. One afternoon, she brought his lunch out to the new corral he was building. He was stripped to the waist, the sun gleaming on the sweat on his back, his muscles moving with a fluid power as he swung the post maul. She stood for a moment, just watching him, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the midday sun. He saw her and stopped, leaning the maul against a post. He came to her, a slow smile on his face, a smile that was no longer a rare visitor but a familiar friend. She handed him the bundle wrapped in a cloth, bread and cheese and an apple. As he took it from her, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting touch, the kind of casual contact that happened a dozen times a day between them now. But in it, there was a current, a quiet and deep as a river, that flowed between them. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, his gray eyes soft, and in that look she saw the whole of his heart, a love as vast and as quiet as the land around them. The children, in their innocent, observant way, saw it too. They adored Abigail, but they were fascinated by the quiet, powerful man who seemed to belong to her. One day, a small boy named Thomas, who had a habit of asking questions that adults were too polite to ask, followed Cole as he was checking the cinch on the boy's mule. "Mr. Maddox?" Thomas asked, looking up at him with wide, serious eyes. Cole grunted in acknowledgement, his hands busy with the leather strap. "Do you love the teacher?" Cole went still. His hands stopped their work. He did not look at the boy. He looked out across the valley, at the distant line of the mountains against the blue sky. Abigail was just coming out of the schoolhouse to ring the bell for the end of the day, and she had stopped, just out of sight, to shake the dust from a rug. She heard the boy's question, and her heart gave a little lurch. She held her breath, waiting. Cole was silent for a long moment. Then he looked down at the boy, and a slow, gentle smile touched his lips. He spoke so softly that Abigail had to strain to hear him. "Every sunrise says I do," he said. He turned back to the mule's saddle, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever. But Abigail stood frozen behind the corner of the schoolhouse, his words echoing in her soul. It was not a declaration shouted from the rooftops. It was a truth whispered to a child, as simple and as certain as the rising of the sun. She felt a blush spread up her neck, but deep inside her, it felt as if 1,000 tiny blossoms were opening in her chest, their petals unfurling in a wave of quiet, overwhelming joy. The town of Dust Valley had begun to see them differently too. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. The story of the trial had, over time, become a local legend, and its meaning had shifted. They were no longer the town's joke. They had become a symbol of something else, of a stubborn, quiet resilience that the people of the valley, in their own hard lives, could understand and respect. When they rode into town for supplies now, they were met not with sneers, but with cautious nods. The blacksmith offered Cole a gruff good morning. The banker's wife, when she saw Abigail, gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. One woman even stopped her on the street to ask her advice on how to teach her youngest to write his name. They had, without ever intending to, become pillars of the community they had once tried to flee. One night, long after the rest of the ranch was asleep, Cole was in the small, repaired section of the old barn that he had turned into his workshop. The main barn was still a ruin, a project for another year, but he had salvaged some of the old, fire-blackened timbers, planing them down until the clean, unscarred wood beneath was revealed. He was working by the light of a single lantern, a carving knife in his hand. He was not whittling a bird or a horse. He was carefully, lovingly, carving letters into a long, smooth plank of wood. When he was finished, he ran his calloused fingers over the words, feeling the shape of them in the darkness. It was a story, their story, a secret meant only for him, for her, and for the quiet ghosts of the barn. He took the plank and nailed it above the door of the stall where he had once slept, the stall that was now used for the gentlest of the mares. The carving was a quiet, permanent testament, a rewriting of their own history. It read, "For the woman who turned a bet into a forever." It was a late afternoon in that sweet, hazy time between summer's heat and autumn's chill. A day's work was done. The last of the children had been collected by their parents, their cheerful shouts fading as they disappeared over the rises. The horses were fed and settled, their soft snorts and the rustle of hay the only sounds from the newly rebuilt sections of the barn. A sense of deep, abiding peace had settled over the lifetime ranch, a peace that had been earned through fire and labor and a stubborn refusal to break. Abigail was tidying the schoolhouse, wiping the slate clean for the next day, when Cole appeared at the door, 2 horses in tow, saddled and ready. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He just stood there, a question in his quiet stance, in the language they had built together. It was an invitation to leave the work behind, to steal the last golden hour of the day for themselves. She smiled, untied her apron, and joined him. They rode out not toward town or the high pastures, but into the wide, open heart of their own land. They moved in a comfortable silence, their horses walking side by side, their legs occasionally brushing. The wind, a gentle and constant presence in the valley, stirred the tall, dry grass, making it whisper. It lifted the fine, reddish dust from the ground, not in a choking cloud, but in a soft, golden haze that caught the slanting rays of the sun and made the air itself seem to glow. It was a beautiful, lonely land, but Abigail no longer saw it as lonely. She saw it as theirs. Every rock and twist of sagebrush felt like a part of their story. Cole led them toward a place they both knew, a small, sheltered spot at the edge of a vast meadow where a single, ancient cottonwood tree stood. Its massive trunk was a testament to the decades of sun and storm it had endured, and its leaves, already touched with the first hints of yellow, rustled and shimmered in the breeze, a sound like running water. It was their place, a natural cathedral where they sometimes came to sit and watch the sun go down, to feel the quiet of the world settle around them. He reined in his horse at the edge of the tree's long shadow and swung down from the saddle. Abigail started to do the same, but he held up a hand, a silent gesture for her to wait. She watched him, a flicker of curiosity stirring in her. There was a different kind of quiet about him today, a stillness that was not born of his usual reticence, but of a deep, focused intention. He walked around to her side of the horse, his boots making soft sounds in the dusty earth. He looked up at her, and in his clear gray eyes, she saw a nervousness she had never seen before. It was a raw, vulnerable look that made her own heart quicken in response. He reached up and took her hand, his calloused palm warm and steady around hers, and helped her down from the saddle. But instead of letting go, He held onto her hand, his thumb tracing a slow circle over her knuckles, and then, with a grace and gravity that seemed to stop the world on its axis, he went down on one knee. He knelt before her in the golden dust, under the rustling leaves of the old cottonwood. His head bowed for a moment, as if in prayer. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Her mind, usually so quick and clear, went completely blank. She could only stare at the top of his hat, at the strong line of his shoulders, at this quiet, powerful man kneeling at her feet as if she were a queen. He looked up then, his eyes meeting hers, and the whole of his heart, the whole of their long, hard journey, was in his gaze. He reached into the small pocket of his vest and pulled out an object that glinted in the late afternoon sun. It was a ring. It was made of silver, not polished and bright like something from a jeweler's case, but with a soft, matte sheen, hammered into a simple, beautiful band. It was not perfect. It had tiny imperfections, a texture that spoke of its creation, a strength that was plain and unadorned. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. "I had the blacksmith make it," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur from an old bullet. She looked from the ring to his face, her vision blurring with sudden, hot tears. A bullet, something from his past, an object of violence and death, melted down and reformed, forged into a circle of promise, a symbol of a new life. He took a deep, unsteady breath. The words, when they came, were the truest things he had ever said. "It started as a bet," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Now, it is my prayer." A sound escaped her, a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. The tears that had been welling in her eyes finally spilled over, tracing paths through the light dust on her cheeks. She looked at this impossible man, this cowboy who had ruined her life and then rebuilt it from the ashes, this silent soul who had spoken the most beautiful words she had ever heard. The joy that filled her was so immense, so powerful, it felt as if it might break her heart wide open. She laughed through her tears, a clear, bright sound that mingled with the rustling of the leaves. "You will lose that bet again, cowboy," she said, her voice trembling. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile that lit him from within, erasing the last of the shadows. He took the ring and gently slipped it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He kept hold of her hand, and with his other, he reached up and touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was once a mystery, a sign of her humiliation, now transformed into the most profound declaration of love. He looked up at her, his eyes shining, and he repeated the words that had started it all, not as a wager, but as a vow. "Then I will take that bet," he said, his smile widening. "In a lifetime, ma'am." She leaned down and kissed him, a deep, joyful kiss, full of the promise of all the sunrises to come. The sun, sinking toward the horizon, sent its last golden rays slanting through the leaves of the cottonwood, a celestial spotlight on the two of them. The wind stirred the dust around them, and the tiny particles caught the light, swirling like 1,000 tiny fireworks, a celebration thrown by the land itself. And from far across the meadow, faint on the breeze, came the sound of children's laughter, a joyful, untroubled sound from the schoolhouse they had built together. It was the sound of the future, and for the first time in its hard, dusty history, the promise of a real wedding bell, a bell that would ring not for a contract or a convenience, but for a love that had been tried by fire and found true. Echoed in the quiet heart of Dust Valley. Time in the valley moved not in the frantic ticking of a town clock, but in the slow, sweeping cycles of the land. It was a rhythm measured in the greening of the pastures, the bleaching of the sun on the hills, and the quiet piling of season upon season. Several years had passed since the fire and the trial, and they had settled deep into the soil of the lifetime ranch, taking root like the cottonwoods Cole had so patiently planted. The ranch was no longer a place of bare survival. It was a testament to prosperity born of hard work and a shared vision. A new, larger barn stood proud and strong, its unpainted wood already weathering to a soft, silver gray. The corrals were full of fine horses, and the fields were healthy and well-tended. The small, one-room schoolhouse now had a new wing, added to accommodate the growing number of children who came each day, their minds as hungry for knowledge as their bodies were for food. The ranch had become the true heart of the valley, a place not of judgment, but of growth. On quiet evenings, when the last of the chores were done and a gentle quiet had descended, Abigail would often sit at the large wooden desk in the main room, the silver pencil, a constant companion, felt warm and familiar in her hand. She no longer spent all her time with the ledgers of the ranch, for those were now in perfect order. Instead, she wrote in a leather-bound journal, filling its pages with the story of their life. She wrote not of accounts, but of the accounting of a life, a journey she still found miraculous. She wrote of a proud, lonely woman and a silent, grieving man, and of the clumsy, violent, beautiful way they had found each other. On one page, she had written in her clear, elegant script, it began as a wager made in malice, a thing of shame and dust. But a home is not built on its foundation, but on the life that is lived within its walls. And what started as a bet has become a shelter, a roof over my heart. Their partnership had borne fruit in more ways than one. They had a son, a boy of 4 named Samuel, who had his father's quiet watchfulness and his mother's bright, curious eyes. He was a child of the ranch, as comfortable on the back of a gentle pony as he was on his own 2 feet. He was the embodiment of their future, a living symbol of their love. Cole, the man who had walled himself off from the world, had found a new purpose in the small, trusting hand that slipped so easily into his own. He was a patient and loving father. On the porch steps, in the cool of the evening, he would sit with Samuel, teaching him how to coax a simple, wavering tune from a harmonica. The sound, one high and clear, the other small and breathy, would drift out into the twilight. A sweet, imperfect harmony that was the sound of Cole's own healing heart. He had planted a line of young cottonwood saplings around the house, their slender trunks reaching for the sun. He was no longer a man who lived only for the day. He was a man planting shade for a future he intended to see. Their standing in the community had transformed so completely, it was as if the past belonged to a different set of people entirely. They were no longer the outcasts, but the anchors. When disputes arose between neighbors, a disagreement over a stray calf or the rights to a spring that was running low, it was not to the sheriff they went, but to the porch of the Lifetime Ranch. They would come, hats in hand, and lay their troubles at the feet of Cole and Abigail. Abigail would listen, her sharp mind cutting through the anger to the heart of the matter, and Cole, with his deep, practical knowledge of the land and of human nature, would offer a solution, a compromise that was always simple, always fair. Their justice was not the cold, hard justice of the law, but the warm, compassionate justice of neighbors. One morning, the world awoke cloaked in the deep, profound silence of the first snow. It had fallen overnight, a soft white blanket that smoothed the hard edges of the land and made everything new again. The air was cold and clean, and the only sound was the crunch of Abigail's boots as she walked from the house to the woodshed. Later that morning, as she was tidying the main room, putting away some of Samuel's wooden toys, she opened a large wooden chest in the corner, looking for a warmer blanket. And there, at the bottom, lying on a folded piece of canvas, was the hat. It was Cole's old hat, the one he had worn that first day in the saloon. It was battered and sweat-stained, a relic of a life he no longer lived. She picked it up, the felt soft and worn under her fingers. She held it in her hands, and the memory of that terrible afternoon came back to her, not as a fresh wound, but as a faded scar, a reminder of a pain that had long since passed. She remembered the heat of her own shame, the sting of her hand against his cheek, the cold finality in his eyes as he had turned and walked away. It had been the worst moment of her life, and it had been the beginning of everything. She carried the hat with her to the front door, on a series of pegs by the door. They hung their everyday coats and hats, and on the wall just beside it was the plank of wood Cole had carved, the one he had hung in the old barn and then moved here when they had rebuilt. Its words were a quiet, constant reminder of their promise. She reached up and hung the old, battered hat on an empty peg. Right next to the carving, the symbol of the bet and the testament to the lifetime, now hung side by side. They were not two separate things, but two parts of the same story. The West was not a gentle place. It was a land of harsh sun and unforgiving wind, a place that could break a person with its vast, indifferent silence. But sometimes, in the spaces between the grit and the dust, between the hardship and the heartache, people found the one thing soft enough to soothe the soul. They found each other's hearts. As the sun set, casting long, purple shadows across the snow-covered valley, a warm, golden light spilled from the windows of the ranch house. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, its flames dancing and casting shadows on the wall. Two of those shadows were larger, a man and a woman. Sitting close together, a third, smaller shadow moved between them, and from the small, warm circle of light, the sound of a harmonica drifted out into the cold, clear night, a simple, sweet melody that was soon joined by a second, smaller one. The music floated on the still air, a lullaby for a valley that had finally found its peace before it, too, was swallowed by the vast, silent, and star-filled dark. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.